Hello everyone, Dark of All Trades here. The title of today's video has a lot of promise for quality content, and maybe even some good answers, or at least arguments for the existence of a god. So today, we're going to look at a video by Grace Baptist Church of Richmond Hill, which seems to be part of a series they call Out of Neutral, titled, "This Convinced Even the Most Adamant Atheists That God is Real." Well, you aren't going to find a more adamant atheist than me, so perhaps this is going to be the rock-solid logic that some god needed to show me to get me on their side. So let's see what convinced the most adamant atheists that some random god is real.
Today I want to talk about what convinced even the most adamant atheists that God is real. It's amazing how many things we accept on faith.
If by faith you mean...
They mean believing unquestionably in things for which there is no evidence whatsoever.
My definition of faith is the excuse people give for believing something when they don't have a good reason.
It is never wise to be completely convinced of anything told by another without question, without reservation, or without reason, or simply to assume anything without precedent or parallel, especially in the absence of verifiable evidence and despite all the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. That is about as irrational as it is possible to be. In practical application, faith is irrational by definition.
Then I accept nothing on faith. Everything I accept as true or likely true has sufficient evidence to warrant acceptance. However, if by faith you mean confidence, then sure, though I'm not sure why that's amazing to you, that is just how our brains work. We likely cannot know anything with 100% certainty, so we assign a degree of confidence.
In science class, we're taught about the existence of molecules and dark matter, and we all nod our heads in acceptance.
Why do you think this is? Seriously, take a moment and think about why students in a science class accept what teachers and the textbooks say. I'll wait. Do you have an idea? Could it be that some of these things we learn in science class were studied for years, decades, or even centuries or millennia? Depending on the level of science class, some of these things are meant to be accepted because to go into the how we know these exist is not the point of the lesson. For basic chemistry classes, the student doesn't need to know how we know atoms exist in order to understand the idea of molecules and chemical reactions. They can do basic experiments and see how different materials react to heat or water. If the students really want to know how we know molecules exist, they can investigate how we know, do the experiments, and come to the exact same conclusions as countless people have come to before them, but for the purposes of the class, it is considered settled science. Dark matter is a bit different, but with the same methodological idea.
In history class, we learn about the lives of Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte, and no one questions their reality.
Same idea here as the last one. With history, just like with science, there are ways of determining whether something actually happened or not. With things like science, there is experimentation, testing, discovery, the scientific method, etc. With history, the criteria as to whether someone existed or not is not quite as cut and dry, but we still can make educated evaluations. For the existence of a specific person, historians look for primary sources. This includes things like physical evidence, like photographs, artwork, and writings, which deal directly with the subject in question. So how do we know Julius Caesar or Napoleon Bonaparte existed? Well, for the sake of expedience, we have solid physical evidence from primary and secondary sources. Historians also use certain criteria for how we establish that people actually existed and were not made-up legends. Feel free to pause the video and read these 5 points. However, just like with the science class, depending on the level of the class, we accept that these people exist because the lesson is about the history of whatever era or the area the lesson is covering. Teachers don't have time to gather all of the physical evidence that every single person that they're talking about actually existed. If a student in one of my lessons stopped me every time I brought up an author of a book or poem, or talked about how certain people introduced a new word which made it into the English language, just to ask me to prove that these people existed using primary and secondary sources, we wouldn't be able to get to all the subject matter I need to go over. Could I show that William Shakespeare existed? I certainly could, but that would take time away from the lesson. For the sake of the lesson, we accept the consensus and move on.
But when it comes to the existence of God or the life and message of a person like Jesus, the standard changes.
It sure doesn't. We accept all of those things you said before this because it is considered settled in an academic sense. I accept that what is taught in the classroom is true because I can verify all of it for myself using as close to the objective methods as possible, and especially using the methods that we generally use to determine what exists for literally everything else. The issue with any god is that they fail the test. The same could be said about your Jesus, but for the sake of conversation, I often grant the existence of the human generally referred to as Jesus. It is the rest of the attributes that religious people put on him that fail the test. We can't test for the existence of your God, which I assume you would assert exists today. We have literally zero contemporary sources for the existence of this Jesus. We don't have anything from a secular source from the 1st century. Josephus' supposed writings about Jesus are generally known to be a later forgery, so the earliest secular writings we have that mention that a guy even existed are from Tacitus around 115 CE. So, applying the exact same standards as the other examples, we don't accept the evidence of your God at a minimum. As for what a supposed Jesus said, even granting that this guy existed, we don't have any writings by this person, and the earliest of the Gospels wasn't written until around 69 CE. That's roughly 36 years after this person's supposed death. One would think that such a prolific and important figure in history would have something from the time he was alive, but we don't have that, unlike with Julius Caesar or Napoleon Bonaparte.
We need evidence and confirmation, and rightly so.
Well, this is a first for me, admitting that it is right to require evidence for the existence of a God and Jesus. So kudos to you, sir, for saying this. Though, as I stated, we need evidence for any historical figure or scientific fact. It is simply that your God and your Jesus do not meet the criteria for existence required for acceptance.
We recognize that there's more at stake. Challenge is to figure out what that evidence might actually look like. What could God, if he exists, do to convince us that he's real?
This is a classic question often asked to atheists, but not really pondered by theists. Theists are already convinced that a God is real, so they likely don't need to think about this. Atheists have a wide range of answers to this question. Often showing up and doing something that only a God could do is a typical short answer. For some, the answer may be something like, I don't know, but your God would know and has chosen not to do it.
I think our first instinct is to say, I'd need God to show me, to convince me that he's real. That seems like the scientific solution. I wonder how practical that really is, though. First, it would require asking God to appear personally to every person on the planet in every generation in history. Not hard for God, I guess. But would one appearance really settle the matter? If not, how many times?
One appearance probably wouldn't settle the matter. As for how many times, the answer is as many times as needed to sufficiently do an examination under reasonable circumstances. But why is this question relevant? Couldn't a God just appear whenever asked with literally zero effort on his part? So why is this even an issue?
It's easy to imagine a person having this incredible experience of God and the next day second guessing. Did I imagine that? Was I hallucinating? And what if you do believe? What do you do next? Wait for God to appear again? The fact is that many people have been moved to faith after Jesus appeared to them in a dream, or they had a remarkable encounter with God's presence.
If we can assert this evidence for the existence of your Jesus or God, then every person who was moved by faith after their religious figure like Odin or Morpheus appeared to them in their dreams, or they had an encounter with lightning causing them to hallucinate an experience with Zeus, must be able to put all of that on the same level as your evidence here. Conversely, wouldn't I be able to say, I did everything I was told to do to have an experience with a God, and in my dreams, where there should have been a Jesus, nothing was there. Therefore, this is evidence that a God does not exist?
I've met some of them, and have heard the accounts of others. I think that's the last resort, though, rather than the standard way. There's another way that many people haven't considered. Would you find it convincing if Jesus appeared to someone prominent?
Not in the slightest. Of course, this hypothetical is begging the question because the whole argument is assuming the conclusion, proving Jesus exists. 1. Jesus appeared to someone prominent. 2. Therefore, Jesus exists. By appearing to someone, we have to assume that Jesus exists in order to do so, so this idea falls apart from the onset.
A young Jewish scholar named Saul was committed to stamping out the young sect. He'd given his support to the stoning of a Christian martyr named Stephen already, and now he was headed to Damascus to arrest more. On his way, he was blinded by a light in the sky. and a voice from heaven revealed himself to be Jesus. That voice directed him to Damascus, where he was told he would be given further instructions. There, a Christian who had also heard from Jesus through a vision appeared at the door of his house, healed his blindness, and baptized him. What do you do with an account like that?
Press X to doubt. Looking over the story in Acts 9, let me grant as much as I can here. I will grant that this person existed and was big and mean to all the Christians he could be. I'll grant that he was on the road to Damascus. I'll grant that he thought he saw something. I'll even grant that later he met someone who also claims to have heard from this Jesus character. I will even go so far as to grant that he was temporarily blind. There are too many questions left over, like why didn't his traveling companions hear anything? In Acts 26, it said that the light shone on all of them, causing them to fall to the ground. If I were to grant that a sudden light appeared, this leads to more questions, ignoring the source itself. Do we have any evidence anywhere that lights of any brightness cause people to fall down under any circumstances? There was a couple I was able to find. Perhaps the sudden light caused a seizure. This may explain other medical issues as well. Mess with the brain and you may get unpredictable results. Another idea may be a type of extreme photophobia. Why do we accept this as Jesus rather than a hallucination of some kind? If, rather than Jesus, which no one else recognizes there, we assume some sort of natural issue, like a seizure causing the fall, potentially including head trauma. Looking at the Redefining Seizure Care website, the symptoms of seizures could be overbearing tendencies. This would better explain neurological issues including hallucinations, radical shifts in thinking, single-minded conversation habits, and psychosis. As for the traveling companions, if I were traveling with someone around this time who was known for putting people to death for simply not agreeing with them, if he told me he saw a light, I would say I saw it too. I would agree with what he said just to keep my head. So at this point, what is more likely? A hallucination caused by seizures and people too afraid to contradict a ruthless murderer, or that there was a light brighter than the sun on earth that caused people to fall down only in a very specific spot that no one else was around to see, which was actually a mythical figure who was murdered and spoke in a way that only one of the people there could hear and understand that there was speech at all? In every other circumstance, most people would take the former.
Maybe you're thinking, he could have just made up the story, though. That could be true of anyone, I guess. But in Saul's case, he had everything to lose and nothing to gain by making up the Jesus story and converting to the faith. He would have lost the status and reputation he'd been developing for years. Most of his friends and family members would turn on him. As a Christian, he would be beaten, imprisoned, and eventually executed for his faith. It's almost impossible to conceive of him making up this story.
I don't agree, but even so, I can grant that he didn't knowingly make up the story. Seizures are relatively common, with 1.2% of Americans being diagnosed with some form of active epilepsy. It is not difficult to believe that this prominent figure had it and some of the mental effects from it. Let's take someone today. If some prominent atheist had a Damascus Road experience and converted to Christianity, that would be big news in the religious community. It would be all the religious people talked about for a long time. They still bring up Anthony Flew and his conversion from atheist to deist, actively denying any Christianity conversion. This happened to him in 2004, and religious people still mention him as if it were some sort of relevant experience. Consider if Richard Dawkins, my personal feelings on him aside, or Matt Dillahunty converted to Christianity after being so outspoken against it. However, this doesn't seem to work in the other direction for religious people.
What's even more remarkable is how he changed. The person who had tried to stamp out Christianity went on to write almost half the books of the New Testament. The one who was known to threaten his opponents with violence and murder became known for his message of grace and love. The man who had started his career vowing to take people's lives ended his career by giving his life for his newfound faith in Jesus. How do you explain the change in his life apart from the appearance of Jesus to which he testifies?
Some sweet shifting of the burden of proof here. It is not up to me to offer a counter explanation to why something happened. I can just say, I don't know, and you still have all of your work cut out for you. There are countless claims of experiences with other deities. So how do you explain these experiences apart from the appearance of those deities? This is one big argument from ignorance. You don't know, therefore it must be this explanation. Nothing else other than because he said so. As I stated before, seizures explain it pretty well. I'm not a neuroscientist, but this isn't brain surgery.
Jesus appeared to him and transformed his life as evidence for you and for me.
Still begging the question. However, the argument continues to suffer from the same issues I brought up earlier. If you can use this argument, then so can everyone else. Vishnu appeared to someone in India and changes his life as evidence for you and me that Vishnu exists. Baal appeared to his followers and changed their lives as evidence that Baal exists. Everyone who Jesus doesn't appear to and change their life is evidence against the idea for you and me. If your argument can be used against you, then it isn't a good argument.
Jesus had your doubts and mine when he revealed himself to Saul. Respond to him today.
Smashes the block number button. So what was it that convinced the most adamant atheists that God is real? Let's summarize. There was a guy who really hated Christians. One day, on his Christian-hating excursion, he was walking with a couple of guys who were paid to travel with him when suddenly they saw a really bright light. It was so bright that they fell down. You know how light normally makes people fall down usually? Then, nothing happened to anyone but the guy who was telling the story, who says he heard the voice of someone who was murdered by the government for which this guy works. The voice told the main guy that he was the dead guy and didn't want the main guy to persecute a group of people who happened to like this dead guy. Then he was blind for a few days, totally not anything neurological or anything like that. And all of this was definitely not the result of falling down and hitting his head. So he had a radical shift in personality, just like Phineas Gage, who had a severe personality change when he got a railroad spike driven through his head, did. Then he met someone a few days later in a different place who also claimed to be sent there by the same dead guy. So what is the best explanation for this story? Even granting literally all of the mundane claims, relatively common medical issue that was not known about then is considerably more likely, along with scared traveling companions and a single coincidental meeting with another guy. I don't buy it, and neither should anyone else. So what did you think? Did you find the story of the Damascus Road experience convincing at all, or do you think that there's a different explanation than what I have? Let me know in the comments below. I'd like to do more with this story, and I would love more input from people. As per usual, hit the like button to keep the standard of evidence the same for the existence of my channel. You can absolutely prove you're not a hallucination by subscribing, thus giving solid evidence that you are in fact more real than God. As always, keep learning.